Have you ever, paused to really think about what happens after we draw our last breath? Or maybe wondered if our minds, our consciousness, our very essence, does it just stop? Or does it continue somehow? It's one of those massive questions, isn't it? Has fascinated people, maybe even scared them, for literally thousands of years. Well, today we're doing a deep dive into exactly that, looking at one of the most ancient and honestly persistent attempts to answer it. We're focusing on one of philosophy's absolute giants, Plato and his theory of immortality. We're going to really explore the core ideas that didn't just influence ancient Greece, they fundamentally shaped how the West thinks about the soul, the body, and what it even means to seek knowledge.
That's absolutely right. And for this deep dive, our main sources are key sections from the history of Western philosophy. We're zooming in particularly on Plato's dialogues, especially the Phaedo and the Crito. These are crucial. We'll be looking at their profound implications. Our mission basically is to unpack Plato's really quite radical ideas about the soul, the idea that it's enduring, maybe even eternal, and how that belief connects directly to the pursuit of truth and wisdom. And maybe most importantly, why these ancient thoughts still seem to resonate so strongly today. We want to give you a kind of shortcut to being genuinely well-informed on this foundational philosophical concept. So we'll distill the key arguments, pull out some surprising details, and really grapple with the questions that make Plato still feel so relevant.
It sounds like an amazing journey. So what can we expect? Where are we starting? We're going to begin by looking closely at Socrates' final hours, his almost unbelievably calm approach to his own death. It's quite something. How those last moments became this powerful philosophical statement in themselves. Then we'll dive into Plato's fundamental dualism, that really stark separation he makes between the body and the soul. It can be challenging. After that, we'll explore the sometimes controversial idea of philosophical asceticism. What did Plato actually mean by that? Before moving on to understand how Plato thought we truly know things, his idea isn't learning, it's recollection, anamnesis. And finally, we'll follow the soul's sort of imagined journey after death, exploring its destiny and the moral weight of how we live. And that's where I think the real depths of Plato's thought starts to unfold. It gets really interesting there. Okay, so let's begin. Let's step back into ancient Athens and witness Socrates' farewell. A philosophical stance on death itself. Our starting point is incredibly dramatic, really poignant. Socrates' final hours, as Plato paints them in the Phaedo Dialogue.
And it's important to remember, this isn't just presented as like a news report of his execution. No, it's a deliberate, carefully crafted philosophical declaration by Plato. He's solidifying Socrates' legacy here.
Absolutely. The Phaedo gives us this incredibly vivid picture of Socrates' last moments. His conversations just before drinking the hemlock, his calmness, even as, his body starts shutting down. He's shown not just as a good man, but, and this is a direct quote, wise and good in the highest degree. And crucially, showing absolutely zero fear of death. What's really fascinating, and you touched on this, is how Plato presents Socrates' composure. It's not just bravery. It's shown as the living, breathing embodiment of his deepest philosophical beliefs. It takes abstract ideas and makes them concrete, intensely personal, incredibly powerful. So his final hours aren't just some tragic ending. No, they're framed as this profound teaching moment, designed to show the strength, the consistency, the truth, really, of his convictions. The source highlights this, saying his conduct in face of death, as represented by Plato, was important ethically, both in ancient and in modern times. It even makes a pretty striking comparison. It says the Phaedo was for pagan philosophers what the gospel account of the Passion and the Crucifixion was for Christians. That really underscores its massive historical and ethical impact. It's the narrative of a philosopher martyr. And this powerful opening scene immediately sets the stage for the whole theory of immortality, because Socrates' lack of fear, it stems directly from his absolute conviction that death isn't the end, it's just a transition for the soul.
That's so powerful, isn't it? His calm wasn't just like putting on a brave face for his students. It was his philosophy, lived out right to the very end. It showed his beliefs weren't just intellectual games, but a real profound way of living. But his commitment, his principles, they weren't only clear in those final moments. There's another key dialogue, the Crito, where we see him actively choosing his fate. He could have escaped.
Precisely. The Crito tells the story of how his friends, especially Crito, made arrangements for him to escape prison. And by all accounts, it was a pretty viable plan. The guards might have even looked the other way. Maybe the authorities were getting a bit tired of the whole situation themselves. But Socrates, he flatly refused. His argument was that escaping would be wrong, it would be illegal. And more than that, it would violate a core principle he held dear. A principle that sounds remarkably like something from the Sermon on the Mount, actually. We ought not to retaliate evil for evil to everyone, whatever evil we may have suffered from him. It just shows this incredible, unwavering commitment, not just to Athenian law, but to his own deeply held ethics. even when following them meant accepting his own death sentence. It really highlights that his philosophy wasn't just abstract talk. It was a practical guide to life, applied rigorously, even in the worst possible circumstances. It really underscores that idea that true wisdom means living consistently with your beliefs, no matter the cost.
Right, he didn't just passively sit there. He actually argued against escaping. He imagined having a conversation with the laws of Athens themselves. Our source says, in this imagined dialogue, the laws point out that he owes them the kind of respect that a son owes to a father or a slave to his master. End quote. Wow. That's more than just obedience, isn't it? It's like a deep reverence for the system that shaped him. He even apparently advised people that if they didn't like Athens' laws, they should just leave, emigrate, rather than stay and break them. It was an active choice he made, not just passive acceptance. What does that kind of commitment tell you? About the power of conviction, the sheer weight of living by your principles when it's that hard, demanding everything. It's almost uncomfortable, really. It makes you think about what it truly means to embody a philosophy. And this unwavering commitment, this deep conviction, it brings us back to that almost mystical description of Socrates' serenity in his final moments. The picture Plato paints is both deeply philosophical and, well, kind of spiritual.
It really is a moving portrayal. In the Phaedo, while he's waiting for the poison, Socrates talks about hearing this music, specifically like the sound of the flute in the ears of the mystic. That's a very specific image. And he says this internal sound is the voice of philosophy itself, a sign of his total focus on thought, even then. He accepts the sentence calmly, lets them take off his chains, and just carries on talking with his friends. Deep philosophical discussion. He seems much more interested in the nature of the soul than his own impending death. This portrayal really emphasizes his inner peace, his focus on higher eternal truths. His indifference to death is shown as the direct, logical result of his belief in the soul-body separation, and crucially, the soul's immortality. For Socrates, death isn't an end. It's presented as a release, a transition. And when his friends ask him why suicide is wrong, which seems a bit odd, given his situation, right? His answer, which the source notes is in accordance with Orphic doctrine, sounds almost exactly like what a Christian might say later on. He talks about death not with certainty about the details, but as a mystery. He compares it to standing before a gate. You know, something's beyond it, but you haven't opened it yet. That's not dread. It's philosophical curiosity, acceptance, rooted in this deep conviction about what comes next.
So his philosophy wasn't just arguments on paper. It gave him this deep, comforting certainty that went beyond the physical body, which leads us right to the core of it all. What did Socrates and Plato, building on him, truly believe about our very being? It's time to unpack this central idea of dualism. Okay, so moving from Socrates' death scene, let's get into the bedrock of Plato's theory, this fundamental dualism. At its heart, Plato's whole philosophy divides things up. There's a huge split. Reality versus appearance, ideas or forms versus sensible objects, things we can touch and see. I mean, most fundamentally for our discussion, soul versus body. This isn't just a small distinction. It's like the foundation stone for his entire way of thinking. And for Socrates, as Plato shows him, death is simply that final separation, the soul leaving the body, something maybe even welcomed.
It is absolutely foundational. You can't really grasp Plato without getting this dualism. He posits these two, fundamentally different realms of existence. First, you've got this perfect, unchanging, purely intelligible world. The world of forms or ideas. Think of perfect justice, perfect beauty, perfect goodness. These aren't things you can see or touch. They're eternal blueprints, perfect archetypes. You can only grasp them through pure reason, through intellectual vision. And then second, there's our world, the familiar world of sensory experience. It's imperfect, constantly changing, perceived through our physical senses. This is the world of, beautiful sunsets, specific just laws, kind acts, none of which perfectly capture the ideal form. Now for Plato, the soul. It belongs to that first realm, the eternal, perfect, intelligible one. The body, though, with its senses, its needs, its temporary nature, that belongs firmly to the second realm, the changing sensory one. The source is very clear on this, listing reality and appearance, ideas and sensible objects, reason and sense perception, soul and body. And here's the crucial bit. These are connected. The first in each pair is superior to the second in reality and in goodness. So it's not just a separation, it's a hierarchy. The unseen, intelligible world is actually more real and better than the physical world we see. That's the really audacious move Plato makes. Turning common sense on its head by saying the unseen is more real, it set the stage for centuries of philosophy.
That is a powerful and definitely counterintuitive idea. Think about how you experience the world. Do you ever get that feeling, that sense that there's something deeper, more perfect behind the surface? Like you hear a piece of music and it's beautiful, but you feel there's an even more perfect version of that melody somewhere. Or you see an act of courage, but you feel it points towards some absolute ideal of courage itself. Plato would say, yeah, it's your soul. That's your soul reaching for the real, for the forms it remembers, trying to connect with those perfect patterns. Okay, but if the soul is that pure, that divine, and connected to these perfect forms, then the body, our physical self, with all its needs and messiness, it must be a pretty big problem for the soul, right?
Oh, it's much more than just a problem. For Plato, the body is described as a constant source of endless trouble. Seriously. It actively hinders the soul's main job, which is acquiring true knowledge. It's always distracting the soul with its needs, its desires, its fears, its illusions, all sorts of follies. The body is often seen as, yeah, an instrument, but sometimes even as a literal prison for the soul, holding it back from its true potential. The source lists specific examples. Diseases which overtake and impede us, they stop us thinking clearly. Also, fears and fancies of all kinds, they cloud our judgment, and just general follies. Plato even blames big societal problems like wars and fightings and factions on the body. He argues they stem from the love of money, and money has to be acquired for the sake and in the service of the body. It's quite a claim, if you think about it from a modern angle. How often do physical things pull you away from deep work or thought? Hunger, tiredness, notifications buzzing, anxieties about how you look or what people think. Plato basically took that everyday experience and pushed it to its ultimate philosophical conclusion. He argued that true, pure knowledge simply cannot be gained through the body's senses, only when the mind is gathered into itself, free from sights, sounds, pain, pleasure. Only then can it perceive reality clearly.
Wow. So the body isn't just inconvenient. It's actively pulling us away from truth, according to Plato, which makes understanding what the soul is even more vital for his whole argument about immortality.
Exactly. The soul, in Plato's view, is the complete opposite of the body in many ways. It's described as simple meaning, not made of parts. It's divine, unchanging, eternal. It's the part of us capable of pure thought, the part that seeks out absolute justice, beauty, and good. Crucially, it belongs to the same category as the Ptero forms the eternal things. Its nature, its purity, simplicity, unchanging essence is what makes immortality seem not just possible, but logical within his system. Because it's simple, uncompounded, it can't be broken down or dissolved, theoretically, unlike the body, which decays, as the source puts it really well. The soul, being eternal, is at home in the contemplation of eternal things, that is, essences, but is lost and confused when, as in sense perception, it contemplates the world of changing things. It's stable, consistent. Physical things change, fade, die. This core difference leads directly to what Plato saw as the philosopher's main goal, to liberate the soul from the body's dominance. And this, naturally, takes us straight into that sometimes tricky concept, philosophical asceticism.
Right, that idea of the eternal soul trapped in a temporary, distracting body. Liberating it, that's a huge task. Which brings us neatly to our next section, the ascetic path, philosophers and pleasures. So, if the body is a hindrance, and the soul is divine and wants pure knowledge, it makes sense that a true philosopher, someone really committed to wisdom, would try to minimize the body's influence, wouldn't they? This is where philosophical asceticism enters the picture. It's about living in a way that prioritizes the soul. The philosopher's main goal, Plato says, isn't getting rich or famous or having maximum bodily comfort. No. It's liberating the soul from the body's endless demands and pursuing pure knowledge, free from sensory distractions. This means consciously stepping back from excessive bodily pleasures, eating too much, drinking too much, focusing heavily on sensuous experiences or even fancy clothes and adornments.
Yeah, but it's really important to get the nuance here. This isn't about, say, extreme self-punishment or starvation in the way we might sometimes think of asceticism today. The source makes this clear. The philosopher should not care about eating and drinking, but of course he should eat as much as is necessary. There is no suggestion of fasting. So it's not about not eating. It's about not being obsessed with food, not letting it dominate your thoughts or actions. It's more like a strategic detachment. Consciously freeing the mind from the body's constant nagging demands so it can focus on higher things, on intellectual pursuits. The philosopher's real food is wisdom, right? Not physical stuff. They need to be entirely concerned with the soul and not with the body. Turning away from sight and hearing, which Plato calls inaccurate witnesses to what's truly real. There's an interesting line suggesting that life isn't worth living if you have no sense of pleasure and no part in bodily pleasure, meaning, paradoxically, that a life only focused on bodily pleasure is actually empty. So the philosopher shouldn't be bothered with pleasures of love or for costly raiment or sandals or other adornments of the person. They're just seen as distractions from what truly matters for the soul's growth.
So it's not about becoming a monk in a cave, necessarily, or denying yourself basic human needs. It's more about fundamentally reevaluating your priorities. What does that mean for you listening now? It's maybe a prompt to think about where you put your energy. Is it mostly into things that are fleeting, Physical comforts, the latest trends, constant entertainment? Or is it also invested in things that might last longer, like intellectual growth, developing inner wisdom, understanding the world more deeply? It's about consciously choosing what gets your primary care and attention. And this idea, detaching from the body for higher purposes, wasn't totally out of the blue for Plato, was it? He was kind of building on older ideas, bringing them into philosophy. There's some interesting historical links here.
Absolutely. Plato's philosophical take on asceticism connects clearly to older mystical traditions, especially the Orphic doctrines. These were ancient Greek beliefs that held the soul was divine, immortal, but had somehow fallen and gotten trapped in the body, almost like a punishment. The goal in Orphism was to purify the soul and free it, often through ascetic practices. The source explicitly says, the Orphic proclaims himself the child of earth and of the starry heaven. From earth comes the body, from heaven the soul. And adds, it is this theory that Plato seeks to express in the language of philosophy. He gave it a rational framework. We also see echoes later in things like Manichaeism, another strongly dualistic tradition emphasizing spirit over matter and asceticism. And maybe most significantly, these ideas really resonated with early Christian theologians. That whole theme of the spirit struggling against the flesh, that became central in Christianity. For many early Christians facing persecution, the duty to stand firm and accept death rather than renounce faith wasn't entirely dissimilar to Socrates' stance. So Plato wasn't just inventing this stuff. He was synthesizing these existing mystical currents with a rigorous philosophical argument. He gave asceticism an intellectual basis that helped it persist and influence thought for centuries. It really shows how philosophy and religious thought were deeply intertwined back then, sharing roots in this fundamental human quest for meaning and transcendence.
That's a fascinating thread running through different traditions. This detachment seems like a powerful tool. But, importantly, our source also gives a serious warning, a cautionary note about the dangers if asceticism goes wrong, if it's misused.
Yes, and this is a really crucial point, a vital caveat to Plato's argument. While Plato advocates for asceticism aimed at wisdom and virtue, the source warns strongly against taking this detachment to extremes or twisting its purpose. It says, quite chillingly, that liberation from the tyranny of the body contributes to greatness, but just as much to greatness in sin as to greatness in virtue. That's profound. Simply denying the body isn't automatically good. Its moral value depends entirely on why you're doing it and who you are. The text gives some stark examples. It mentions many eminent ecclesiastics who renounced sensory pleasures but weren't careful about other vices. They became dominated by love of power, leading to appalling cruelties and persecutions. They denied the flesh but embraced a different corruption. And then there's a particularly jarring example. Hitler belonged to this type. By all accounts, the pleasures of sense were of very little importance to him. Now, this isn't about judging his diet or lifestyle. It's a philosophical observation. His detachment from physical pleasures didn't make him virtuous, quite the opposite. It perhaps even freed up energy for him to pursue his monstrous ideology with ruthless focus. What's really key here is how the text distinguishes between the means and the ends. Asceticism is a means, but if the end goal is corrupt power, ideology, self-aggrandizement instead of wisdom, then the means itself becomes corrupted. It can lead to terrible outcomes. It forces us and you to ask, how do we make sure our own pursuits, even noble-sounding ones like seeking knowledge, don't somehow become vehicles for vice instead of virtue?
That's a really sobering point. It forces you to look at the motivation, the why behind the what. So, okay, if pursuing wisdom means getting beyond the body's limitations, a huge question pops up. How do we even acquire knowledge in the first place? If our senses are unreliable, our bodies are trouble. How do we know anything for sure? And this is where it gets really, really interesting. Plato's theory of recollection, anamnesis. Right? So for Plato, true knowledge isn't something you get from outside, like pouring water into an empty cup. It's not even learning in the usual sense. He argues pretty radically that it's actually recollected, remembered. His idea is that our souls, being immortal, existed before we were born into these bodies. And in that prior existence, they were in the realm of the forms, directly encountering perfect concepts, absolute equality, absolute beauty, absolute justice, absolute goodness. So learning in this life isn't acquiring brand new information. It's actually the soul remembering what it already knew from that perfect prior state. It's like an internal rediscovery.
Exactly. This theory, anamnesis or recollection, is an incredibly clever and powerful argument, not just for how we know things, but for the soul's pre-existence and immortality. Think about it. How can we grasp a concept like absolute equality? We never actually see perfect equality in the physical world, right? No two sticks, no two stones are ever absolutely identical in every single respect. Yet we understand the idea of absolute equality. We know what it means. So where does that understanding come from? If not from our senses? Plato says it implies our souls must have encountered the perfect form of equality somewhere else, before this life, before being limited by imperfect physical examples. The source puts it directly. The second argument is that knowledge is recollection, and therefore the soul must have existed before birth. Oh, it elaborates. We have experience of absolute equality, but absolute equality is never found among sensible objects, and yet we know what we mean by absolute equality. This points to a type of knowledge that just seems to transcend everyday sensory input. It suggests something innate within the soul.
Have you ever had that experience? Maybe wrestling with a tough problem, maybe a math problem or a conceptual one, and you're stuck, just stuck. And then suddenly, bang, the answer just clicks into place. Like it was there all along, you just had to uncover it. Or maybe listening to a piece of music or seeing a piece of art for the first time, and it feels deeply familiar, like you've known it forever. Plato might say, that's your soul, having a moment of recollection, remembering a fundamental truth, a pattern, an echo from before this life, that aha moment, but like on a cosmic level. And Plato didn't just throw this idea out there. He tried to demonstrate it, quite dramatically, actually, in the Phaedo Dialogue, with that famous example of the slave boy.
Yes, this is a classic. It's a key piece of evidence Plato uses to make recollections seem plausible, even persuasive. In the Merino, Socrates talks to an uneducated slave boy, someone with zero formal training in geometry. And through just asking questions, very skillful Socratic questions, not feeding him answers, he guides the boy to figure out a complex geometrical truth: how to double the area of a given square. Socrates is careful not to teach the boy the solution. He just prompts him, challenges his assumptions, helps him reason it through. The boy makes mistakes at first, naturally, but with Socrates' questioning, he corrects himself and arrives at the right answer. For Plato, this is proof positive. The knowledge wasn't put in by Socrates. It was drawn out from the boy's own soul. It was already there, waiting to be recollected. As Socrates famously says in the dialogue, there is no teaching, but only recollection. If you think about the bigger implication, it suggests that fundamental truths, maybe mathematical, maybe ethical, are potentially accessible to everyone, not just the highly educated, because they reside within the soul itself inherently. They just need to be brought out, remembered.
So the slave boy wasn't learning geometry from scratch. He was remembering it. Remembering something ancient his soul already possessed, and this amazing ability to remember things from before you were born. That leads us straight back to immortality, doesn't it?
Directly. The ability to recollect implies the soul existed before birth. It had to exist somewhere to gain that knowledge in the first place, right? And if the soul existed before birth, already possessing these eternal truths, well, it's a pretty reasonable step to argue it will likely continue to exist after death, too. It strongly supports the idea of its immortality. So the recollection argument isn't just about how we learn. It's a crucial pillar supporting the whole idea of immortality. It connects epistemology, how we know, directly to metaphysics, the nature of the soul. As the text points out, this argument successfully proves about half of what was required, specifically that our souls existed before we were born. The other half, proving the soul will exist after death as well as before birth, still needs more argument, but recollection provides a massive piece of the puzzle. It suggests our capacity for understanding isn't just a temporary byproduct of our physical brains. It's rooted in something far more enduring.
Okay, so the soul's been around forever, basically, picking up these eternal truths along the way. But what is this soul, fundamentally? What's its actual nature? And what does being eternal mean for where it ultimately ends up once it's finally free from the body? This brings us to a closer look at the soul's true nature and its destiny. One of Plato's most elegant arguments for the soul being immortal isn't just about what it does like recollecting, but about what it is, its basic composition, or rather, its lack of composition. He argues the soul is simple, uncompounded. Unlike the body, which is obviously complex, made of many different parts, and therefore can fall apart, dissolve.
Right. This argument really taps into Plato's core metaphysics, his whole understanding of reality. For him, things that are truly simple, fundamental, unchanging, like the forms themselves, perfect beauty, perfect justice, those things are eternal, indestructible. Think about it logically. Anything made of parts can, at least in principle, be broken down into those parts. It can decompose. The body, with all its cells, tissues, organs, systems, it's a perfect example of something compounded, complex, and therefore temporary, perishable. But, Plato argues, if something is genuinely simple, if it has no parts to break down into, then it can't be dissolved. It can't be destroyed by falling apart. So the soul's simplicity, its uncompounded nature, is presented as a key logical reason for why it must be immortal. The source explains this very clearly. What is simple, it is thought, cannot begin or end or change. It continues. Now, essences are unchanging. Absolute beauty, for example, is always the same, whereas beautiful things continually change. Thus, things seen are temporal, but things unseen are eternal. The body is seen, but the soul is unseen. Therefore, the soul is to be classified in the group of things that are eternal. It's fascinating how he uses logic and observation about change and permanence to build this framework where the soul just naturally fits into the eternal category. Of course, it raises that tricky question. If the soul is unseen, how can we be so sure about its nature? It pushes us into abstract thinking about ourselves.
That is a very neat logical argument. Simplicity equals eternity. Complexity equals decay. But Plato, through Socrates and the Dialogues, never just presented his ideas without testing them. He always addressed objections. And a really significant counter-argument came from Simmias in the Phaedo. It's one that still kind of resonates.
Yes, this is a really important moment in the dialogue. It doesn't weaken Plato's case. It actually strengthens it by showing Socrates tackling a serious challenge head-on. Simmias brings up this analogy. He suggests maybe the soul is like a harmony, like the music produced by a lyre, a stringed instrument. It's beautiful, complex, maybe even seems divine in a way. But Simmias argues, when the lyre itself, the physical instrument, analogous to the body, is broken, destroyed, well, the harmony, the music, it just ceases to exist, doesn't it? So maybe the soul, like the harmony, disappears when the body dies. It's an intuitive analogy for many people, even now. But Socrates, being Socrates, takes it apart skillfully. He offers a couple of main refutations. First, based on what we just discussed, a harmony cannot exist before the lyre exists to produce it. It depends on the instrument. But the soul, as argued through recollection, does pre-exist the body. So, boom, the analogy breaks down right there. Second, and this might be even more fundamental, the soul, in Plato's view, isn't passive. It actively guides the body. It commands it sometimes. It often fights against the body's desires, pushing for virtue for reason. A harmony, on the other hand, is just a result. A product of the lyre's strings, their tension, how they're played. It has no agency, no will of its own. It can't command the lyre. The source sums it up. Socrates replies that the soul is not a harmony, for a harmony is complex, but the soul is simple. By showing exactly why the harmony analogy doesn't fit the soul's preexistence, its active nature, its simplicity, Socrates powerfully reinforces his own view of the soul as independent, enduring, and commanding. It makes the immortality argument stronger.
That really demonstrates the power of philosophical debate, doesn't it? It's not just about having an idea, but defending it against clever objections. What stands out to you about that counter-argument? It's not just knocking down the analogy. It's really emphasizing the soul's active role, its independence, from just being a byproduct of our physical stuff. Okay, so the soul is simple, eternal. It existed before us. It's not just a harmony. So what happens next? After death. What's the soul's ultimate fate in Plato's grand vision?
Right. According to Plato, death isn't the end of the story for the soul. It moves on to a new state. And crucially, that state is directly linked to how the soul lived while it was in the body. There's a strong moral dimension here. Basically, the good souls, those who pursued wisdom, virtue, philosophy, they go to a kind of heaven, a place of bliss, maybe in the company of the gods. The bad souls, those dominated by vice, greed, bodily desires, they face a kind of hell or punishment. And then there are those in between who weren't wholly good or wholly bad. They might go to a sort of purgatory, a place for purification. The true philosopher gets special mention. Having lived virtuously, having worked in life to be liberated from thraldom to the flesh, freed from the body's distractions, their soul, after death, departs to the invisible world to live in bliss in the company of the gods. It's the ultimate reward for philosophical living. So immortality isn't just a neutral fact, it's deeply tied to ethics. Your afterlife depends on your earthly life. This really stresses the importance Plato placed on living philosophically, pursuing virtue now. In contrast, he paints this vivid picture of the impure soul, the one that loves the body. It's so attached to the physical that after death, it will become a ghost haunting the sepulcher, unable to fully leave the earthly realm. He even suggests souls might transmigrate based on their character. A gluttonous soul might become an ass, a violent one, a wolf, maybe a merely social one becomes a bee or an ant. It's quite imaginative. But this whole structured idea of an afterlife with rewards and punishments linked to earthly behavior was hugely influential. You can really see how it fed into later religious thinking, especially early Christian ideas about judgment and the afterlife. It shows the lasting power of Plato's vision.
That's a really detailed picture of the afterlife, all tied back to moral and philosophical choices made here on Earth. A significant legacy indeed. Let's explore that legacy a bit further now, the legacy of Plato's theory. It's honestly hard to overestimate how much Plato's ideas shook things up. His theories didn't just hang around ancient Greek philosophical schools, they fundamentally shaped Western thought, especially on the soul, immortality, and the very basis of morality. And this influence wasn't just limited to philosophy, it reached deep into other areas, including, maybe surprisingly, early Christian theology.
Oh, absolutely. Plato essentially provided this incredibly well-developed intellectual toolkit for ideas that became central to various religions. His arguments for the soul existing before birth, its struggle against the body, its eternal destiny, these offered a strong philosophical grounding for concepts that really resonated with emerging religious views. The source is explicit here, stating, "The theology of St. Paul and of the Fathers was largely derived from it, directly or indirectly." That's a huge claim. It means core aspects of early Christian doctrine, as shaped by key figures like St. Paul and the Church Fathers, were either directly influenced by Plato or understood through a Platonic lens. In fact, the source even makes that striking comparison we mentioned earlier, that for many the story of Socrates' death in the Phaedo was considered profoundly important, second only to the death of Christ, it repeats. What the gospel account of the Passion and the Crucifixion was for Christians, the Phaedo was for pagan or free-thinking philosophers. This really cements its status as a foundational text, shaping how people understood virtue, courage, and facing death for one's principles. So, what does this mean for you? Understanding Plato isn't just history. It helps you see the deep roots of so many ideas still floating around today about the soul, morality, the afterlife. It gives context to centuries of thought.
And right at the center of this massive legacy is the figure of Socrates himself, at least the Socrates that Plato presents to us. This Platonic Socrates isn't just a historical figure or a character saying Plato's lines. He's presented as the absolute ideal of a philosopher.
Indeed. The Socrates we get from Plato is the archetype, the wise, just, virtuous man, described emphatically as the wisest and justest and best. He's portrayed as completely unafraid of death, deeply ethical in all he does, and relentlessly pursuing knowledge and truth. He's not really focused on science in our modern sense, but on ethics, metaphysics, understanding virtue, reality, the good life. He became a pattern to subsequent philosophers for many ages, a model of intellectual honesty and moral courage. This portrayal serves as the ultimate example of how to live philosophically. Live according to truth, value wisdom above everything else, be indifferent to worldly success, maintain inner calm, stay calm and urbane, even facing execution. All because of this deep conviction about the soul's true nature. His courage in facing death is particularly highlighted, especially when you consider the practical impact of his beliefs.
Yes, and this is where the enduring power really hits home. The source makes that final point, that Socrates' courage in the face of death would have been more remarkable if he had not believed that he was going to enjoy eternal bliss in the company of the gods. Okay, which isn't meant as a criticism at all. It's acknowledging that his philosophy wasn't just abstract theory. His profound convictions directly shaped his actions, gave him that serene strength that still inspires and challenges us thousands of years later. It's a powerful reminder that for thinkers like Plato and Socrates, philosophy wasn't just about thinking. It was about living and dying in line with what they believed was true. Wow. So we've taken quite a journey today. We've walked through Socrates' incredibly calm final moments, seeing them as a philosophical act. We've unpacked Plato's powerful dualism, that fundamental split between body and soul, appearance and reality. We considered the demanding, sometimes tricky path of philosophical asceticism, understanding it as detachment for the sake of wisdom. And we discovered Plato's fascinating idea that we don't learn truth, we recollect it, remembering what our eternal souls already know.
We saw how for Plato, the body can be seen as a real source of trouble, a distraction, and how knowledge is about tapping into those eternal truths within.
Exactly. And if you connect all this to the bigger picture, Plato's theory of immortality, it's not just some dusty old idea. It offers a really profound way to think about our own relationship with our physical selves, our drives, our search for knowledge, maybe even our ultimate purpose. It really pushes you to think critically about what you truly value, where you invest your time and energy, where you look for lasting fulfillment. It encourages looking beyond the immediate, the fleeting, the superficial, towards maybe something more enduring, more eternal.
So after this deep dive into Plato's world, here's something to maybe mull over. If, as Plato suggests, true knowledge, these universal truths, actually reside eternally within your own soul, just waiting to be recollected, what fundamental truth might you be right on the edge of remembering right now? And perhaps what noise, what distractions, what attachments might you need to consciously shed or at least quiet down to truly access it?